So welcome to today's webinar hosted by WWF, Climate Action Network, WWF-Chile, and others. I'm Nathalie Unterstel. I'm the director of Talanoa, which is a think and do tank tracking climate change policy in Brazil, and I will be your moderator. I'm thrilled to have an incredible panel of people from all facets of climate change policy to talk about the current and the desired state of NDCs. Just to set the stage a little bit, nearly 200 nations decided to keep global temperature well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. And countries set out policies in the form of nationally determined contributions, the so-called NDCs, in the run-up to the COP21 in 2015. However, the sum of those policies leads us to a warming of 2.9 degrees by the end of this century. And as we are all aware of, this will lead us to catastrophic consequences. So here we are in year 2020, 5 years after Paris, and when countries are due to submit new and enhanced NDCs. A few NDCs have been submitted. WWF has reviewed all of them, and we know already that as important as they are, they represent a small percentage of the global emissions. So more ambition by more and major emitters is needed ahead of COP26. And we are here today to discuss exactly that, where these submitted NDCs are taking us and what needs to be achieved by 2021 in terms of mitigation to keep us on the path to 2 or 1.5 degrees global warming. So we have a distinguished panel today. I would just go down very quickly to the titles of our speakers. So we have Manuel Pulgar Vidal, the WWF Climate and Energy Practice Lead. Welcome, Manuel. We have Nicholas Hone. Thank you. We have Nicholas Hone from the Climate Action Tracker and the New Climate Institute. Welcome, Nicholas. We have Fernanda Carvalho, the WWF Global Policy Manager. We have Pablo Vieira, the head of the NDC Partnership, and Rodrigo Catalã, the Conservation Director for WWF-Chile. Originally, we would also have Marianne Tofgard from the Climate Action Network, but unfortunately, she had a last-minute cancellation, so we won't have Ken with us today. And I should say that in the Q&A session, we will be joined by Deborah, also from the Climate Action Network. So for all of our attendees, I just want to remind you that you can submit questions using the Q&A pane at any time. So we will use the end of our session today for answers and discussion around the issues that we have in here. And we also invite you to visit the WWF website to learn more about the analysis of all the NDCs that have been submitted to date. So with that, I would like to invite Manuel to give us some opening remarks. Welcome, Manuel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie, and hello to you, everybody. I am more than delighted to be part of this event and to give some words to trying to frame discussion. So we are here to discuss NDCs, the NDC we want. But the starting line is where we are, no? And what should we do to really enhance NDCs? So let me start by saying we are clearly close to ending the 2020. A year that we used to think would be the super 2020, no? And we know that because of pandemic, we have postponed events, we have taken some decisions because of the pandemic and the lockdowns and those kind of measures to avoid that disease. But that shouldn't mean that we don't have things to do still in this year, in the 2020. And one of those things, it is the NDCs. And why? Probably you are wondering why Manuel is talking about that still we have in our hands a main task, that it is to work in enhancing our current NDCs. And there are many reasons for that. The first reason it is that everybody has to recognize that the current NDCs were presented before of the Paris Agreement. As you know, the NDC as a concept was created in Warsaw in COP19 in 2013, and it was a fantastic mechanism to recover confidence because it was created as a way to create a bottom-up process, only way to move the world into an agreement that fortunately we got in 2015. But we did it without rules. We did it in a voluntary basis. We did it without mechanism to track progress and those kind of things. And it was because the idea, the main focus, it was to create confidence. But after that, the Paris Agreement decided that the NDC must be the most important means for implement the Paris Agreement. So when we think on how are we planning to implement the Paris Agreement, one of the main tools to do that, it is the NDC. And for sure, the NDCs referred in the Paris Agreement are not exactly the same INDCs that we decided 2 years before. Are NDCs that must be supported on science, are NDCs that must be defined ways to track progress, to be measurable, and also must be incredible NDCs that really included action that can be adopted. So that is the first reason that when we think about NDC, it is the mechanism to implement. But also the NDC, it is a mechanism to answer or to say to science that we are listening what they have said to us. We know that the IPCC in the former months, they released 3 important reports. The IPCC 1.5 special report, the land and the certification, and the ocean and cryosphere. And they are suggesting clear actions and they are modeling what it could happen if we are not able to act. So the only way to really fit with what science is suggesting to the planet, it is by including clear actions through our NDCs. And those actions should also answer to what are called the transitions. IPCC is suggesting transitions in energy, in industry, in land use, in cities, among some other sectors. So we do need to define through our NDC that we are not willing to walk those transitions, but also to implement concrete actions that can make us in a clear trajectory. The third reason, and probably you are going to raise that, it is the sense of urgency. And when we think about climate, we know that we are not yet in a clear trajectory. And that means that we haven't defined yet concrete actions to put the world in a way that could achieve the net zero economy by 2050 and the 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So to be more clear, current NDCs are not enough. And currently, you have mentioned it, Natalie, just 17 countries have put on the table their new NDC. What it is good for them, but not enough good for the planet. We do need to have the big emitters. We do need to have everybody putting a new and already enhanced NDC on the table. And that must be done by the end of this year. We are expecting to have many countries doing that through the 12 summit organized by the UK government to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. I hope that this event can be an encourager to countries to fulfill with that. I hope that by the end of this year, around the 12th, we can have dozens of countries and hopefully most of the world with a new NDC on the table. And let me finish by saying that also the NDC, it is an important mechanism because it is the only way to show real commitment. This is not about words. The words are not enough. The only way to show that a country, it is really committed to the objective, it is by a clear NDC. There are no alternatives. So that is important to say to the world. And also the NDCs, it is a good way to connect the short-term actions with a long-term vision. If we know that this process, it is irreversible, and these are words of former President Hollande from France, it is unstoppable and irreversible, the only way to have our economies fitting with that vision, it is with a clear NDC. And finally, the NDCs, it is the best mechanism to engage domestically actors, not only from the public sector, but from the private sector, from the communities, from the civil society, and to connect levels. No? So not only the national one, but the subnational, to municipalities, to communities, to population, to citizens. So that is the importance of the NDC. And that is why the importance of today's event. So I hope that these words can help to frame the discussion. And thank you to all of our panelists for today. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to you all.
Wonderful, Manuel. Thank you so much for reminding us where we need to go, and actually also to call for clear NDCs. That's precisely what this conversation is going to be about. Thank you very much. And now I'll turn over to Nicholas Hone from the Climate Action Tracker. He will talk about the current NDCs from a mitigation perspective. Welcome, Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this webinar on this, I think, very important question on the NDCs that we want. Well, I'm Niklas Höhner with the New Climate Institute and representing here this project, which is called the Climate Action Tracker, which is a project together with Climate Analytics. I need to leave a bit early, but then my colleague from Climate Analytics, Deborah Ramelow, will take over for the questions and answers later today. So really sharing it half-half. The Climate Action Tracker is a project that is, as the name says, is tracking climate action already since 2009. The one thing that we always do is we look at the action and calculate a global temperature increase by the end of the century on the basis of what all countries have put on the table. That's something that you may be aware of, and we rate countries NDCs. But we do a lot more, looking at decarbonization and provided some benchmarks towards sectoral decarbonization for different sectors. We look at governance. We have a governance series. We have this climate target update tracker, and we have a whole series of scaling up, of showing opportunities of what more can be done. So this is just to tell you, have a look at the Climate Action Tracker website if you are interested in those things as well. But the real talk today is about the status of the NDCs. And I want to say 4 things here. The first one is about the status of NDC updates. Actually, we only have a few. Then I want to say something about green recovery, whether the potential has been used or not. Actually, not too much yet. Then I want to say something about a whole wave of net zero targets, which we think is an actually positive, extraordinary development. And then give you an update on temperature increase that would come about if all of these targets are really implemented. So some reason of hope. So going to the first one, status of updates. We said already in the Climate Action Tracker, we first look at the NDCs that are out there. We rate them in a certain rating method, looking at all potential ways that how you could see whether it's a fair contribution to the overall problem. And the developed countries usually have more historical responsibility and capability. That's why much more stringent things are demanded from them and less stringent things from the more developing countries. But in aggregate, we see many, many countries not doing sufficient action in their NDC so far. And that goes across the board. If we calculate everything together, if countries are implementing the pledges that they have put officially on the table, so the current NDCs and some of the long-term targets, then we get to a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees by the end of the century, assuming that all countries implement what they've proposed. Right now, they're not in aggregate implementing everything they have proposed, because if we look at current policies, which is the level of emissions that comes out of the currently implemented national policies, we arrive at 2.9 degrees at the end of the century. So this is far away from the well below 2 or the 1.5 degree goal or limit that we have in the Paris Agreement. So we are not a little bit off, we are totally off. So all that basically means to me, all countries need to step up, no matter how big, how large, think what can be done to do more, because we are so far away from the goal that we have all agreed in Paris. Now, what's the status? Manuel already alluded to it. The official submissions are, I would say, disappointing. We have a few countries that submitted new NDC targets. We are counting here those that have new targets. Yeah, so not only an NDC, but also a new target, showing that they want to increase their mitigation ambition. And we, in the Climate Action Tracker, don't analyze all countries. We analyze 36, the biggest. And of those, of the big countries, it was so far only Chile, Norway, and Vietnam, which provided a new and more ambitious target, which is very good and is commended. But unfortunately, they are not the largest countries. We have another list here of countries that have already said that they will not update their target. Japan is still thinking of doing that now with the new net zero target, so that may happen. US has now hopefully a new president and will also maybe not appear on this list anymore, but the other countries have basically said that the target will not be strengthened, or at least not more ambitious, or lead to more ambitious reductions than before. So this whole picture is still disappointing. Only a small share of global emissions put things forward, so we still have a long way to go. First, not so good message, but well, 2020 is not at the end yet. We still hope that many more come. Second point is green recovery. And we all are very much affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. All governments are trying very hard to support this pandemic and do everything to get out of this crisis, which is very difficult. But it also, if governments move away from rescue measures into recovery measures, so trying to stimulate the economy again, then it could be a potential to do that in a way that is not only stimulating the economy, but also stimulating a transition towards a low carbon world. And first question is, how much money would we need if we want to go in the direction of a low carbon world? And we looked here at model runs that basically looked at the investments that need to be taken annually and to be on track towards a 1.5 compatible pathway. This is a picture here of historic emissions, which are going up still until 2020. And if we would follow a pathway towards 1.5 degrees, how much money would we have to invest additionally in green and low carbon technologies to be on that pathway? And it is actually additional 1.2 or let's say 1.5% of GDP annually globally. So in each country, in each year, we need to invest additional 1.2% of GDP to be in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. These are huge numbers, you know, GDP is large, but this is the order of magnitude. If you do less, well, then you go in a lower trajectory. If actually the pandemic is used to roll back policies and to rebound and to support fossil fuels, then we may even end up with higher emissions afterwards. But let's stay on the positive side. Okay, this is how much we need. Now, how much are countries spending on the recovery in total? And here we looked at 5 countries looking at their total spending for rescue and recovery from the pandemic. And it's huge, as we said, no, up to 14% of GDP in 1, 2, 3 years. Sometimes it's not one, but it's spread over several years. But you can see already here, that's a large, large number. So if only a small share of these spendings are used for the transition towards a green economy, then we would go a long, long way towards what we need to do to be on a trajectory towards 1.5 degrees. So it's a huge potential to do it right. And in this picture here, we looked a little bit at what are kind of green things that are happening, and where is support for fossil fuels still in the recovery measures. And you can see a mix here of green and red, and a lot of uncertainty. So right now, I would say we don't really know what's happening. There's some hint of green, especially I think around the EU and South Korea, but there's also negative things happening in many countries. And here's just examples of positive things that are happening, like more money put into renewables, or helping airlines, and while helping them, attaching conditions to them, or support the renovation of buildings, or charging stations, a lot of good activities that help the economy and at the same time help the climate. But there are also in almost all countries things that are going the other way, basically a foregone opportunity, rollback of environmental policies, bailout of fossil fuel companies, tax reductions that apply to fossil fuel-based technologies as well. So there is still the potential to change it. There's many good ideas, but also some activities that are going in the wrong direction. So that potential of green recovery is not yet used. So I had two negative messages. Now I come to my two positive ones. And the positive one is actually that I think 2 months ago, I would have been, I must admit, quite depressed. No NDCs, no progress, no nothing. But now I think we see a whole wave of net zero commitments. It started with the EU making announcements to update the NDCs. It's not decided yet, but they are in a good way. The 2030 NDCs is about to be updated, and climate neutrality by 2050. That's on the table, which is very good. So a front runner here, moving in the right direction. Then very astonishing to many, I think, was the announcement by China also to aim to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Which is for the largest emitter. It's 25% of global emissions. And if that largest emitter says they want to reduce use of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2060, that's a huge thing. And what I find very important about this, that it creates a wave, so to say, of new net zero targets. I think the Japanese target also going to net zero by 2050. And then the Korean target was, I think, a clear response to EU and China saying that. We now have hopefully a new president in the US who has, like Joe Biden, who has in his campaign the climate neutrality by 2050 as well. So that could also happen. And I think even more, you now start seeing it also in some developing countries. You see companies, 24 top companies of India have said that they want to follow the lead and want to go net zero. You have the electricity company of South Africa moving towards net zero by 2060 or a bit later. So there's a real wave of this activity going to net zero. And still on the positive side, we see here that we cover now a quite large share of global emissions with net zero announcements. So you have the EU, which is there. You have China with 25% of global emissions. You have a whole suite of other countries. In total, it's 126 countries who have made an announcement towards net zero. And then if you add the US to it, then you had 63% globally of emissions covered by countries that have announced that they are considering or agreed to go to net zero. And I think that's a critical mass. That's a wave, I think one wave that you cannot do anything else than just jump on and surf with it. And I think that's very positive. Big caveat here is these are targets. They're far in the future. They are easier to implement or easier to agree on. The difficulty will be the implementation. And that will be then these long-term targets now have to be translated into short-term NDCs, and they then have to be submitted to the Paris Agreement. But staying on the positive side here, I think that's a real game changer so far. And then my last point is the temperature update. First of all, I still have to say that we have this huge gap. I mentioned this before. These are global greenhouse gas emissions. They go up for now. We think with the pandemic, there's a big dip here in 2020. We really don't know how the pandemic is evolving, but let's hope it's over soon. Then it will basically be there to still probably it will only be a dip in emissions, and emissions will still go up. Even if all countries implement all of their pledges and targets. But where we have to be in 2030 is basically cutting global emissions in half. Yeah, not just stable emissions. That's what the outcome of current NDCs is. We need to cut global emissions in half. So we are not, I said it before, we are not a little bit off, we are totally off with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We are stabilizing global emissions while we should halve them. And that basically means the gap is so huge that every country basically needs to go back and think, okay, what can I as a country contribute to closing this gap? All with the caveats there that some countries have more responsibility, some less, but I think all countries can go back and have a look what they can do. Then the temperature impact is what we see here. Just checking, oh, sorry. Okay, I'm just looking at the time, but it seems to be okay. The temperature impact is, as I said already, current policies. So everything that countries are really doing, that they have implemented at home, we get 2.9 degrees. The pandemic gets a little dip, but if the economy runs again, emissions are up again, and we have only gained some delay, but not much on temperature increase. Pledges and targets are a bit lower, 2.7. But here comes, I think, for me, the positive news. China and US are so big that if they indeed would go for their carbon neutrality targets, then China alone would make up 0.2 to 0.3 degrees by the end of the century, and the US could add up another 0.1 degree. So if both of these countries go for net zero by their respective years, we could end up at 2.3 to 2.4 degrees by the end of the century. And we, in the Climate Action Tracker, we do this for 10 years now, and we have never ever seen a big jump like this in the temperature estimate that we have calculated on the basis of 1 or 2 announcements of new actions. Usually it's a frustrating job. Over the last 10 years, our temperature estimate has not changed significantly. But here, for the first time, we see it is changing significantly, and that is a reason for hope, I would say. Coming to my last slide, seeming to be on time, is the 2 negative points were that so far we have seen only a few countries coming up with their officially updated NDCs. And some large number of countries have said that they will not do so. That is disappointing from the climate point of view, and with that we will probably not be able to close the gap. We have also seen a mixed picture on green recovery. It is this is a moment where the transition could be initiated. We've seen some good steps, mainly in Europe and South Korea, but we've also seen some backward steps in a quite large number of countries. For some, for good reasons, because countries are really in danger and need to look after their economies. But in the long run, that is not good for the climate. And maybe those countries need additional help to get the transition done. Then my 2 positive points were the net zero targets can really flip the situation. I would hope that now there's no other way than just jumping on that train and following the lead of and applying net zero targets, and that those will have a significant impact on temperature increase in the long run. All with the caveat that these need to be implemented, and they need to be translated into real action. They need to be translated into NDCs for the year 2030. That's still a important element, but for now, I'm quite hopeful, and for me, it's actually an indication that the process of the Paris Agreement works. Like, countries come up, bottom up, with proposals that they put them forward, and basically by that create a race to the top. And I think that has happened here. Thanks for this, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. This was a great presentation. The message is so clear. So a quick question to you. You mentioned several times that the gap is so huge. So how realistic do you think is to still count on a 1.5 degree scenario?
Well, I have not given up the hope on the 1.5 scenario, because I think what we've seen in the past, that countries have been quite conservative in putting forward pledges. Most countries take the approach that they only put something forward in the short term, which they're pretty sure that they're going to meet. Long term is more aspirational, but short term is pretty conservative, trying to meet it. And we see now such rapid developments on terms of renewables, getting much, much cheaper in terms of electric mobility. So the idea that climate policy is expensive is, I think, no longer the case. In many cases, the renewable option is the cheaper one. And it's a matter of transitioning. It's a matter of changing the current behavior, changing the current system. So the opportunities are all there. They're even more there than before. We also have seen that, especially in the developed countries, governments are ready to take substantial amounts of money to solve a crisis. And that actually makes me also hopeful that if we all understand that climate is the other crisis, or one of the other crises that we need to solve, that at some point in time, governments and the society is ready to also invest a lot of money in that, because in most cases, it will come back as a return, especially in the avoided damages of climate change.
Thank you, Nicholas. I see that we have questions. We're going to address them by the end of, after the presentations, actually. And now I turn over to Fernanda Carvalho from WWF. Fernanda, you've done this comprehensive review of all the submitted NDCs using this checklist. So please share with us what exactly have you done, and what is the situation right now?
Okay, so first of all, let me share my screen. Okay. Oops, not yet. Okay, can you see it? Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
So, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's morning here in Brazil, where I'm based. It's a pleasure to be here today, talking about such an important issue with such distinguished panelists and colleagues as well. My colleague Rodrigo, Manuel, and also Nicholas after this great presentation, and Pablo from the NDC partnership. So I'm going to talk about this work that WWF has been doing that also reviews NDCs, and it's called the NDCs We Want, focused on the part of the question that is where we are. So when we decided to do this work, of course, we know that NDCs are the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement. We know that alignment to 1.5 is the ultimate test, and of course, the climate action tracker is doing a great work in tracking which NDCs are aligned to 1.5 or not. But we wanted to shed a light on other features and policies that also matter for NDC implementation, because as mentioned here, of course, we need to set targets, but implementation is a very important piece of what we need to do. So our checklist aims at setting a constructive and very clear benchmark for incremental progress. And it has a focus on process and structural elements and enabling conditions to build a long-term response. And we also wanted to continue conversation with governments. As you know, WWF has more than 100 offices all over the world. And we wanted to enable our offices to continue conversations on specific features of NDCs. So, this is our checklist that we put together. Of course, in our website here, .org NDCs, you find a longer version, a more complete version of it. that explains what we are looking for in each of the criteria. And of course, this is a qualitative analysis rather than quantitative. But when we're talking about ambition, that we acknowledge it's the #1 feature of an NDC, we are looking at mitigation with strength and mitigation targets, economy-wide absolute targets, a carbon budget that's aligned to 1.5, and we build on the climate action tracker work because, of course, we don't have the same capacities and we are not doing this analysis very, very detailed and very sophisticated for the last 10 years. We are looking at NDCs aligned to a 2050 or earlier net zero long-term strategy, because as Nicholas mentioned, it's great that those targets are coming out, but they will only make sense if they are connected to short-term and mid-term commitments. On adaptation, we're looking at clear adaptation objectives. On finance, we look at finance commitments, what countries are committing from domestic budget, and what are their needs in terms of international support. We are looking at clear conditional targets, moving from conditional to unconditional targets. Under fostering systemic change, we looked at increased sectoral coverage, quantitative sector targets, key structural sectors included, social and just transition policies, and cross-sectoral approaches. We also look at inclusiveness and participation. We would have a detailed dive on participation, but unfortunately we had a cancellation because this is one of the main civil society demands. We want inclusive processes to invite the inputs from citizens and disclosure of information, reporting back on processes, and participatory climate governance structures, because if you look at NDCs from the perspective of social pacts that we want them to be and evolve, all kinds of stakeholders and levels, as Manuel mentioned, inclusiveness and participation will be fundamental. Of course, the contribution to sustainable development, and then we look at alignment with the SDGs and measurable nature-based solutions, and tracking process, whether NDCs have a transparent national system to track implementation. So in our website, you also find a map, and the pins are the ratings that we give to countries. Those are the countries that we have analyzed so far. That can go from the NDC we want to the NDC we don't want. We have also NDCs that have still some way to go and short way to go. I'll detail this a little bit later. But when you click in one of those pins, for example, Chile, the example of Chile here is what I used. And I don't want to give many spoilers because we'll have our Chilean colleagues speaking about Chile. But this is the kind of analysis that we do. We do a broad analysis here that explains advances and gaps and why we are giving this rating to Chile, a short way to go. Chile is not the NDC we want yet, but it has a short way to go. And here is a detailed analysis of what we looked at for every of that criterion that I presented in the checklist. The checklist, remember, has 5 areas and 20 criteria. And then we look at the 2015 NDC, the 2020 NDC, and we do an analysis on how countries are performing in each of these topics. So here is our NDC meter of the NDCs we have analyzed so far. And there are a few more that are not included, but are under the analysis process. So here, NDCs we don't want are Japan, for example, because as already mentioned, what Japan submitted to the UNFCCC was the same NDC that they submitted in 2015. They presented a letter and their INDC as an annex. So this is an NDC we don't want, although Japan has recently reaffirmed their commitment to net zero. And this is great, but for this target to become true, they would, of course, need to resubmit an NDC, and we hope they will do so before COP26. We also included New Zealand here because New Zealand and Switzerland, they have presented documents that are not quite an enhanced NDC, but more a communication on processes to enhance NDCs. So they presented those documents, but the New Zealand one formally states that it is an NDC. Norway and Singapore are NDCs that have some way to go. Norway has increased their ambition, but the main demand from Norwegian civil society is that the NDC made it clear what would be the amount of reductions domestically, and the NDC does not present this information. And on the case of Singapore, they presented the same target. It was an intensity targets that they just presented it as an absolute target. So there has been no ambition enhancement. Here, under the NDCs that have a short way to go, we can see that we have Andorra, Chile. Chile has made strong advances in their NDC in multiple aspects. I'm not going to speak about those because we are going to have a more detailed presentation, but they are not aligned to 1.5. So they still have a short way to go in that sense. We are considering Ecuador as an NDC because what happened with Ecuador is that they have a 2015 INDC and then they only ratified the Paris Agreement in 2017. So the NDC that they presented in 2019 is formally considered their first NDC, but there won't be an enhanced NDC from Ecuador because their NDC is very recent. It's a fairly good NDC with very interesting participation processes. And they are actually one of the front runners because they were one of the first NDCs to comply with the Katowice guidelines from COP24. So although this NDC is not formally considered an enhanced NDC, we are including it. Jamaica, of course, the Marshall Islands, which is a champion in terms of presenting their NDC very early in the process, the first NDC to be presented late in 2018. And here, under the NDCs we have Moldova, Suriname, and Rwanda. They are countries that are not very big from an emissions perspective, but they did really good processes of elaborating their NDCs. And most of the things that we asked for in our checklist are present. And of course, the most recent NDCs, Cuba, Vietnam, they are some way to go. We have started the analysis, but the analysis is not present here yet. And also Mongolia, that is a recent one. So, and Thailand, we are still working on those analyses, but finding that they should be the NDCs that have some way to go, because although they advance in certain aspects, notably adaptation, they don't have stronger targets. Thailand is the same target. And Mongolia, they changed the baseline to calculate their target. So we are still analyzing how that features. And what is a logical conclusion here mentioned by all is that there has been some movement, and this movement is by small countries that don't represent that much in terms of emissions, and we need to advance much more than what we have so far. I wanted to present some highlights. Of course, you'll find the complete document in our website, but this is the kind of highlights that this kind of analysis can provide. So, sorry here. I opened the chat and I got confused and now I don't know how to close, but yeah. So some of the highlights is that we have 9 NDCs that present strengthened targets. That, of course, does not mean that they are aligned to 1.5, but they are stronger targets, and those would be Andorra, Moldova, Chile, and they also refer to a net zero target by 2050. So the net zero target is a movement, as we have seen, not only by the big ones, but by some countries that are mentioning them in their NDCs, and that's also good news, as already mentioned. On adaptation, out of those 17 NDCs that we have looked at, 11 present clear objectives. Developing countries are taking the lead. And Vietnam, although they did not have a significant ambition enhancement, they do mention loss and damage. They are the first NDC in this round of NDCs to mention loss and damage. So this is also a very interesting conclusion, that there was a discussion on whether adaptation should be part of NDCs or what is the relation of NDCs and adaptation. And this seems to be a trend that is growing. On the finance side, we see that the developing countries are advancing on defining their unconditional and conditional targets, which is an ask that we have in our checklist as well. The conditional targets, of course, they would benefit from more detail or the rationale on how they have been calculated. Some countries present that, others not, and some good examples are Rwanda, Suriname, and Ecuador that provide specific details on the sectors that they need support for, and also what would be the priority for them with their domestic budgets. And we even have Chile. Chile was the only country so far that moved from conditional to unconditional targets. There are no longer conditional targets for Chile. Under fostering systemic change, we have seen that increasing the sectoral coverage has been a key way of enhancing NDCs by developing countries. So if those countries don't have yet economy-wide targets, they are at least increasing their sectoral coverage, and that is significant. That's a movement we can see. And we have 4 countries that are mentioning just transition policies. That's also something that's important for us under fostering systemic change. And one of those countries, Chile, even has a pillar of their NDCs that is on just transition and sustainable development. I hope we'll have more details about that again in the Chile presentation. And on inclusiveness and participation, as I mentioned before, and unfortunately we won't have the specific presentation on this, it's very important from a civil society perspective that participation processes are taken seriously by countries, because they are relevant for good NDCs and to provide for implementation. For implementing NDCs, you need the buy-in of all those stakeholders that need to be consulted in the process of design. And the best processes, some that could be good examples, are Ecuador, Suriname, and Chile. Ecuador even had considerations for gender mainstreaming in the process. So those are processes countries can learn from. As the NDCs include details on participation processes, of course, the ideal process would entail sharing information in advance, putting in place a mechanism to harness this information from the contribution, from whoever wants to contribute, analyzing this contribution, and reporting back on how the input has been considered. Some countries have done that. Suriname did that, but other countries are not in that perfect stage anymore, but they still provide good examples that could be used. Under contribution to sustainable development, we have 9 NDCs that mention linkages with SDGs. And again, Chile did a very good job because they link every adaptation and mitigation action with the specific SDG that has a relation with that action. And under nature-based solutions, this was also very interesting to look at, because nature-based solutions are growing. The importance of such solutions is being discussed in various fora. We have a strong priority from the UK presidency on nature-based solutions. When you look at what's going on in NDC, you have 11 countries that mention nature-based solutions. The 8th here is the measurable nature-based solutions, because that's what we ask for in our checklist, that nature-based solutions are measurable. So there is some kind of metrics attached to those nature-based solutions. And there is a clear focus on land. Countries are looking more at land than other nature-based solutions, although there are 3 countries, I think it's Cuba, Suriname, and Chile, that also mention oceans. Chile has a very detailed piece on oceans, and the other mentions oceans in the context of adaptation and resilience. And of course, when those targets are measurable, they are usually connected to mitigation. Measuring adaptation, nature-based solutions, it's something that countries are not yet doing. Nature-based solutions are also usually connected to conditional targets. So this is also very important, because if we expect countries to to use the full potential of nature-based solutions, there is a clear demand for international funding. Tracking process is one of the components which countries need to put more efforts into. Although we see some countries, Rwanda, Andorra, Moldova, Ecuador, and Vietnam, that have included in their NDCs some steps they are taking to put such systems in place. So I think this is also an interesting conclusion. We have much more in our website. We did a document of highlights of submitted NDCs that should be up in our website. And we also have the website updated with the latest analysis that we will be doing and that we are doing and will be doing. And the website also has a resources section that has recommendations, that has reports, and some of them are specific recommendations for NDCs. The most recently launched report of those reports is Anchoring Loss and Damage in NDCs. So you find their principles to include loss and damage in NDCs. We launched last month one of those reports on food systems and NDCs, and there will be a recent launch of forest, recommendations for forests in NDCs. Actually, there is an event right after this one, not right after, it starts at 4, in which we'll be discussing the recommendations for food systems and for forests that also are also under the umbrella of this effort that we are calling the NDCs We Want by WWF. So I think that's all on my side for now, and happy to take any questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Wonderful work. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And I will just take advantage that one of our attendees, Sylvie Wobbs, she posed a question that is related to your presentation. So she said, she asked about progress on the adaptation/resilience goal. You mentioned a few times the adaptation components of NDCs. Do you have any thoughts or any insights from your analysis on the global adaptation goal?
Not the global adaptation goal, but I think that countries are advancing in the rationale about adaptation, and they are thinking about adaptation in sectors, which I think it's very interesting. We can see adaptation connected to health in some countries, and also to resilience and vulnerability. So I think it's an interesting development, and of course that comes more from the from the developing country side than the developed country side. On the developed country side, we would like to see in the NDCs amounts that are committed to international support, and namely adaptation. And we are not seeing that on the developed country NDCs, but we don't have that many yet. So I think that what we are seeing already yields some very interesting conclusions on trends and gaps in NDCs, but it's a very small sample, as mentioned already, because we have very few NDCs. But it will be very interesting to try to discuss to try to observe what comes after, and not what comes after, but what comes from 12-12 that now has become an important ambition moment in the calendar. And we also expect that, you know, the synthesis report of the NDCs that the UNFCCC will do has an aggregation component, because that's not clear yet whether it will have an aggregation component or not. And I think that will be key. And we also expect that NDCs will keep coming till well before COP26, as mandated by the Paris Agreement. We know that many countries had issues in presenting their NDCs this year due to COVID, and it is a reality that we'll have some NDCs coming in 2021. So those will be interesting to see as well.
Thank you so much. So time is running really fast, but we have Pablo Vieira from the NDC partnership now, and then we will hear from Rodrigo about Chile's NDC. So Pablo, the floor here is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And let me share my screen now. Let's see. Let's hope this works. I hope you can see it now. Great. So yes, let me start by thanking you. Thank you for this great invitation. And of course, after these two great presentations and the introduction by Manuel, I want to focus on the tendencies that we're seeing from the side of the NDC partnership in terms of where we stand today on the NDCs, on the process of updating them, and the way forward and the opportunities that we see in countries. Of course, the NDC partnership is a coalition of countries and institutions that are working together to support developing countries in the implementation and enhancement of their NDCs aligned with their sustainable development goals, looking for a comprehensive and inclusive way of looking at climate change. And within the different programs and support initiatives by the partnership launched last year its Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP, to support the efforts of countries to respond to the express country needs associated with the updating of the NDCs, to fast track support to enhance countries' NDCs. And through this process, we are supporting 63 countries that represent roughly 16% of the global emissions and 23% of the global population, mostly smaller developing countries. And our focus is to support those countries that have the least capacity to move forward with their climate commitments. These countries are supported through 46 partners that are providing technical and financial support, members of the partnership, and the range of support that provided is immense. We're actually supporting more than 800 specific activities over this 63 countries. And CAP combines the specific technical expertise and financial resources from our members to bring together countries and partners to create a collective impact and synergies through bold collaborative efforts, which are the principles of the partnership. So if we look at the specific efforts under this initiative, what we're seeing is that we can actually see how countries are looking at enhancing their NDCs. So across all regions, it is very clear that agriculture, forestry, and other land uses and energy remain the most significant sectors where countries are focusing their efforts to tackle climate change. And this matches the trends from the first generation of NDCs. So country requests in these sectors include to support them in refining the existing data, in improving the baselines, and strengthening their targets. So moving forward with those areas that are very popular in the first round of NDCs, but making them better and more ambitious. But significant funding from us is also going to sectors that were underrepresented in the first NDCs. So countries are seeing this updating of NDCs as an opportunity to bring other sectors, as this had been mentioned already. And examples of those are transport, waste, water, and buildings. And of course, a stronger inclusion of adaptation components in the new NDCs. For example, aside from energy and AFALU, in Latin America and the Caribbean, the waste sector is receiving significant support, and oceans and coasts, or blue economies, are becoming more and more important in this new set of NDCs. In Asia and the Pacific, we see water and buildings and infrastructure as the new elements that are growing within the inclusion of new sectors in the second round of NDCs. But also the analysis that we're doing of the support that we're providing to countries provides insight into how these countries are working to improve the quality of the analysis and the underlying data that they're using to produce these new NDCs, and how they're engaging all relevant stakeholders, and how all of this is feeding into their updated NDC and laying the groundwork for raised ambition. So what we see is that the support that we're providing across is supporting all enhancement pillars. And when I talk about enhancement pillars, I'm talking about ambition, I'm talking about the quality of the NDCs, and I'm talking about better processes to reach those NDCs. And 84% of the countries that we're supporting are receiving support across those three interlinked areas. This comprehensive approach to preparing the updated NDCs by countries has demonstrated the importance of establishing a strong foundation to actually unlock ambition. So without the quality, without the processes in places, it's very difficult for countries to actually produce higher ambition that is actually implementable, that is actually representative of the country needs. So this comprehensive approach is showing us that all countries that we're supporting are receiving support directly linked to the efforts to increase the quality of their NDCs. So we're talking about things like developing analytical, robust targets. Nearly all countries, 98% of them, are receiving support to strengthen the associated processes. So for example, enabling greater ownership in the NDC revision processes through building capacity at the country level, and at the same time ensuring that more stakeholders are part of the process. And 86% of the countries are receiving specific support that is linked to actually increasing the ambition of their NDCs. So we're talking about supporting strengthening emission reduction targets, or setting sector-specific targets, or adding adaptation targets to their NDCs. We can also further see how countries are doing, or what their intention is, looking at their intended outcomes. That means what they hope to achieve with the support that we're providing. Overall, these intended outcomes are mostly focused on the one side, delivering well-informed and robust targets, as well as long-term capacity building. In terms of efforts to increase ambition, countries are focused on adding and expanding their mitigation and adaptation targets. In terms of improving the quality and implementability of their NDCs, countries are ensuring that these targets are well-informed based on modeling and scenarios. They're realistic with costed targets and cost-benefit analysis, and they're credible with identified funding sources and including clear pathways for their implementation. And countries are also making sure that they have a more inclusive process, focusing on engaging stakeholders as part of national decision process making, and including them in setting the targets, as it was presented by Fernanda in some of the cases. The focus on quality and strong processes is very important. While most of the international discourse is focused on ambition, which is extremely important, I'm not saying it's not, most countries are receiving critical support to build up their national capacity to enhance their NDCs, helping them reduce the fly-in, fly-out consultants that they depended on in the first round of NDCs, and allowing them for sustained country ownership on the NDCs and higher capacity. This will not only allow higher ambition this time around, but even higher ambition the next time around. Let me give you a couple of examples. And each country has a unique approach to NDC enhancement, and they're identifying different ways to progress their NDCs based on their priorities and needs. Chile, for example, is focusing, after presenting its NDC, on making sure that the quality of the NDC, its implementability, is there, with most of the support that we're providing linking the strategic alignment of its NDC with national policies and developing realistic targets. So how to link their development pathways with their climate priorities. And on ambition, Chile is receiving support to develop its long-term strategy that looks beyond, of course, the current NDC targets. Côte d'Ivoire is receiving support to expand the coverage of its NDC by including short-lived climate pollutants and new sectors, and developing implementation strategies and strengthening mechanisms for the monitoring progress against the NDC targets. And South Africa is looking to set new, more ambitious mitigation and adaptation targets that are well-informed and that are grounded in verifiable data, as well as develop a framework for its long-term strategy and ensuring that stakeholders are well consulted and represented through the NDC and LTC processes. So in this sense, we're seeing great progress, and we have some insights by talking to our members. So we have been in close consultation with the countries that are receiving support from the partnership. And after providing them the support, as of today, we see that out of the 63 countries that we're supporting, 6 of them have already submitted their NDCs. And in all cases, they're better and more ambitious. Maybe not as the level that will lead them to 1.5 degrees, as Fernanda was presenting, but definitely they have improved the quality of the NDCs and they have increased ambition. 27 of them are expecting to submit it before the end of the year. So maybe those are some of the good news that we'll see at the end of the year in the Ambition Summit led by the UNFCCC, by the UK. 20 are expected to submit it by June of 2021. And definitely before COP26. And we still don't have information on 9 of them that are still uncertain about when they will submit. But I just want to take a second here because I want to share a thought. It is very clear that there is great urgency, but we need more ambitious NDCs that are realistic, that are implementable, that have high quality. And if countries need a little more time, they should take it. Because the worst case scenario is to have NDCs that are not as good or as ambitious as they could be, because we're pushing countries to rush their NDCs, especially under the current very challenging situation. So I think we should focus on allowing countries to produce the best NDCs they can produce with the support that they need to do it, even if they take more than the next couple of months. And I think that's a big principle of what we're doing in the partnership. But countries are still learning how to best go through this process. And this is a cycle, and we hope that countries get better and better as they receive support and as they learn from this process. So in terms of areas that need to be strengthened, support under CAP has been prioritized for the enhancement of NDCs, but countries need support to fast-track implementation. And this was very clearly said by Nicholas and by Fernanda. And especially if they commit to higher ambition. And mobilization of finance for the implementation is the main challenge that countries are facing. So after 2020, 2021, what we need to do is focus on supporting the implementation of the current NDCs and making sure that finance is mobilized in an appropriate way to implement those ambitious targets. While I showed earlier that sectoral coverage is expanding, still 46% of countries that we're supporting did not request support to broaden the scope of their NDCs. So there are still clear opportunities to expand coverage of the NDCs beyond agriculture, energy, and in general, forestry and land use, bringing in water, buildings, industry, and other sectors. But understanding how to incorporate these sectors into the NDCs requires a lot of work, data, analysis, and the buy-in from the other ministries and other levels of government and other stakeholders. And that takes time and needs resources. So it's something important to consider for the next round. Well, the majority of CAP requests are cross-sectoral, cross-cutting, meaning that they benefit multiple sectors or they benefit both adaptation and mitigation. The mitigation-focused requests more than double the number of adaptation-focused requests. So more can be done to boost resiliency, to boost the role of adaptation on NDCs. Also, while we see a lot of requests on access to finance, there's still room to expand to make sure that countries are ensuring that they're ready to implement their plans. So, for example, only 8% of requests are related to integrating NDCs and climate plans into their national planning processes or budgets or revenue streams. So linking climate and development is fundamental for this exercise, and countries could do more about this. Many countries are requesting support to develop their long-term strategies, but it's still not apparent that they're ensuring that the future development plans and future NDCs are designed with these long-term strategies as guidance. And finally, increasing political will, especially in the wake of COVID-19, is more important than ever. And the pandemic has impacted implementation, enhancement, and support efforts. So it's very, very important to keep climate at the top of the political priorities. And thinking of this, last point I mentioned, and based on requests received from countries, the partnership launched this year what we call the Economic Advisory Initiative, which is a new initiative launched in June to support countries better recover, use their climate priorities to drive their economic recovery. Under this initiative, the partnership is deploying economic advisors to support tailored country-specific requests. And we're supporting 33 countries, deploying economic advisors within 6 months of the requests. And to maximize the impact of this support, countries are defining the scope of work of these economic advisors. And these economic advisors are being embedded in the ministries of finance, the ministries of planning, which are the ministries responsible for the recovery efforts. And based on the initial analysis of the activities that are included in the terms of references for these economic advisors, we have 5 key anticipated results. The first one is that all 33 countries will incorporate their climate ambition, their climate priorities in their recovery and or national plans in response to COVID-19. 88% of these countries are assessing how COVID-19 is impacting their NDCs, their current ones and their new ones, and in general climate action. 64% of these countries are looking to identify low carbon and or resilient projects that could drive the green recovery transformation. And 42% of these countries are strengthening their capacity and systems to better mobilize resources for recovery. Finally, 24 of these countries are developing innovative climate finance instruments and mechanisms. So with this, a quick summary of the work that we're doing both on enhancement and preparation of new NDCs and how we're seeing missed opportunities, but also how countries are taking great advantage of this unique circumstance. And of course, how we're also helping them avoid a reduced commitment to climate action by supporting them in green recovery, by making this an opportunity for countries to actually drive their recovery with their climate priorities. So thank you, Natalie, and thank you, everyone, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Pablo. We're going to save some time for the end, and with no further delay, I will invite Rodrigo to give us this presentation about the main lessons from the Chilean process of reviewing its NDC. So, Rodrigo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Natalie. I will share my screen with you and just tell you that I will try to be short and just a second. Share my screen. Just a second. Yes. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. I will speak about the Chilean case. There is a case of an NDC that has had a strong participation of civil society. And this is something interesting and my main message. First of all, tell you that I'm not in London, obviously. I'm in this beautiful landscape. Somewhere in this landscape is the city where I live, Valdivia, rich in biodiversity, in a country that is also very vulnerable to climate change. And a country that has take the challenge to organize COP25 just after Brazil declined to take this responsibility. And we had, as a country, a very short time to organize this COP. And in the middle of the process, we have the social unrest that you may have all heard about it, that led now from the process for the new constitution. And due to this social movement and the social unrest, COP25 was moved to Madrid, as you know. So there was several circumstances that made that the government was very open to receive support from non-state actors to develop, first to organize a COP, and second to come to the COP with a proposal, at least a draft NDC that was a better NDC, an enhanced NDC compared with the previous internal NDC presented or submitted in 2015 that was highly insufficient, that was not aligned with 1.5, that was conditional and with several weaknesses. So that those circumstances made an opportunity for civil society and non-state actors to actively participate. And we took that opportunity as WWF and we set a list of 15 concrete recommendations for enhancing the Chilean NDC. And we did it just when Chile was announced as a new host for the COP25, and so we did it very, very early, as early as we could, and we made a consultation with stakeholders, with scientists. We organized several workshops and processes to arrive to this priority 15 recommendation. And the first one was to have concrete targets and absolute targets in terms of being carbon neutral for 2050 and having a carbon budget and not conditional, just conditional targets that we had in under 2015 NDC. The reduce in absolute terms is number 2, and to have a concrete coal phase-out plan for 2030 was the third one. To start with the energy transformation, you know that Chile has had an explosion of development of renewable energy, but we also were recommended to work on storage, on transmission, on a whole transformation of the energy sector. Just transition was the next one. Considering the importance of the equity and social equity in the Chilean debate, just transition and the social component was key to be incorporated, and also because we are one of the most vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities are also already suffering from climate change. Protected areas was another one. We have 21% of Chile territory under protection, and that is an asset. That is something that can be managed for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Forest restoration, of course, we have an opportunity for restoring degraded lands and areas that have been replaced by other uses of the land, and also sustainable forest management. Stopping deforestation with the goal of net zero net deforestation and degradation, and also working in sustainable landscapes, landscapes that can combine several uses, producing food, energy, but also protecting nature and water and all ecosystem services. The 10th recommendation was about oceans. Ocean was in very few NDC in April 2020 when the NDC was submitted by Chile formally, and even by less countries in 2019. So having the role of oceans on adaptation and mitigation was quite innovative, and we strongly advocate for that. Nature-based solutions for adaptation was in 2019 is not as well as developed as now, and has been also part of the recommendation, including fresh water. The water scarcity is one of the main impacts of climate change in Chile, so fresh water needed to be in our NDC. Cities, most of the Chilean population is living now in cities, and so including cities in the NDC. Smart cities for climate change and resilience was the number 13, including the finance and the role of finance in climate was the recommendation, and Chile was part of the coalition of ministers of finance that signed the Helsinki Principles. So we had an opportunity there, and finally the last one was not stopping with the submission of the NDC, but continuing the process with this multi-stakeholder platform to implement actively the NDC. So having presented this recommendation on media directly to the government, to scientists, to stakeholders, we had quite positive results. That's more or less in green, yellow, and red, the result of the adoption of our recommendation. The recommendations that are in green were fully adopted by the government. The ones that are in yellow were partially adopted. For instance, the coal phase-out plan is there, but it's for 2040, not for 2030. For instance, forest restoration is including pine and eucalyptus plantation for pulp and paper, and mainly, and we have doubts that this could be considered as forest restoration. But still, there is a goal on having a national restoration plan, and so on. Just terrestrial protected areas is not included. We are quite satisfied of the well accepted the level of acceptance of our recommendation, and we can see that both the NDC evaluation system and the climate action tracker both recognize that we have a Chilean NDC that has enhancement, and we can say that civil society and WWF has contributed for that. So we can feel proud of it, and we can learn from that process that civil society can play a role on that, on enhancing NDC. It's not just government, the non-state actors, including not just NGOs, the private sector, the scientific communities. We can play a strong role on enhancing NDC. We have to be at a timely or a good moment in advance to arrive with systematic set of recommendations based on science and actively engage indigenous people, women, all the stakeholder groups, but it's feasible and it will be lessons for other countries. And the other lesson that I highlight is that if the NDCs are participatory designed and well communicated, as it was in Chile, NDC can be part of a common agenda for the whole country to become a low carbon economy and a resilient society. We are discussing now a new constitution, and I'm sure that NDC is much more than a commitment for the Paris Agreement. It's an agenda for the country, for as I say, for a greener country, and it is part of the also a milestone for the long-term strategy. Next steps is implementation. We want to be part of civil society, not just on the design of the NDC, but also in the implementation. And we have a set of commitments from the private sector, and civil society is highly engaged in the process of monitoring and supporting the implementation of the NDC. And we think we can do better, because even if we have an enhancement in the NDC, we are not aligned with the 1.5 degrees. We have to do better, and there are opportunities to do better. The long-term strategy is a process that is going on right now with a strong support from the international community, and with a strong participation also from civil society. We have opportunities in energy, strong opportunities in energy now with green hydrogen, electromobility, sustainable building, the coal phase out, energy efficiency, and a strong role of forests. So the long-term strategy for being carbon neutral will be the next challenge, together with the implementation. That's my presentation. Thank you very much, and open for questions.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I think we have a very short time now, so I will invite all of you to be very concise in the answers. I think we will have time for one, perhaps two questions, so please bear with us. Let's start with the question by Max Kindred, and that will be to Deborah from the Climate Action Tracker. So Max is asking, he's saying that a lot of companies and nations are now creating net zero commitments to reach 1.5 degrees warming. We need to create carbon negative targets, as Action Tracker showed on the graph. So how do you see the transformation to carbon negative targets going, and who will take the lead? Deborah, please.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, obviously 1.5 would require very rapid emission reductions and deep changes in all sectors. So after 2050, negative emissions would need to happen to still meet 1.5. And as you would have seen in Nicholas' presentation, for instance, on the US, the difference for USA is 0.1 degrees if going to zero, and 0.2 degrees is also going negative after 2050. So yes, definitely, that's the response in short.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you for being with us. Now to Rodrigo and Pablo, a question here from Clara Milwes. She's asking, how would you rate the potential of climate policy co-benefits to increase ambition in the NDCs? So are co-benefits helping to increase the ambition and maybe the quality, Pablo? I don't know if you can answer to that. So maybe we'll start with Pablo and then go to Rodrigo.
Thank you very much. And this is extremely important. I think that, in fact, in many senses, we have to turn around the narrative to be able to bring in the ownership of the different sectors. I think that it is very clear that for countries to achieve their social and economic goals, they need to look at climate as a driver. And if our narrative focuses on that, I think that the ownership from the different sectors that are responsible for the implementation will increase a lot. So it is extremely important. And a lot of the analysis that we're supporting is about those co-benefits. It's about the costs and the benefits associated with climate action, but also linking the climate action activities to the achievement of those goals associated with the SDGs, but also with the specific sectoral goals. So if we can demonstrate, and it's very possible, and it happens a lot, that actually climate action will drive the achievement of those goals, then the ownership and the implementation will accelerate. So it's extremely important, and that's a lot of the analysis that we're doing, and it's the best way to bring in sectors so that they can take the leadership in implementing actions.
Rodrigo.
Very shortly, there are big opportunities on the jobs creation, in all the solar energy explosion that we have had in the recent years. So if we can invest in going even faster, we will have those benefits in terms of jobs and benefits from the economy. And all the measures for adaptation in terms of water access will be critical for vulnerable communities. So all the restoration of watersheds will be a significant benefit of enhanced NDC.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And last but not least, Fernanda, we have a question here from Yusuf Ibrahim. He asks, what is the fate of African countries towards achieving net zero, considering how the continent is adversely affected despite contributing less to global carbon emission? That's a tough one.
Yeah, you gave me the tough one, but I mean, fairness and equity are, of course, key in a key component of ambition of countries, and we expect countries to contribute in accordance with their contribution and, of course, their capacity too. So there are countries that are bigger emitters, much more relevant than Africa. Not all African countries, because we know that South Africa has a trajectory that is relevant. So we expect that those countries will take the lead in reducing emissions. And that ambition, as I see it, it encompasses, and it's in the checklist, it encompasses not only mitigation, but also adaptation and finance. So I think support to the African countries will be crucial. We cannot ask that countries that don't have the capacities in place become net zero. We expect that the ones that have the capacities in place will take the lead on this, but we need all hands on deck. So we need to look for the right solutions on the right places. And that's why I think this conversation with everyone that is looking at NDCs and analyzing NDCs, that is supporting NDCs enhancement, Pablo, of course, and his work is the one that will give us the answers that we won't have now, but we'll have them in due time, hopefully.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for our attendees for bringing up all of these important questions. And we appreciate very much your time, your hope, and of course, there's a lot of work to do. So please enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to see you again in future events.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to everyone that joined.
Thanks. Great, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.